Hey everyone, here we are in the second lecture of week 1 in Hume 188G summer session. So in the first opening lecture, I gave you a preview of what the concepts communication, culture, and sport are. It was really an overview of the topics of the course, previewing just some of the things that you can expect to dig into. In this lecture and the next one, we're going to dig into these ideas even further so that you establish a good foundation of like definitions and what it is we're talking about. And from my perspective, I want to make it very clear why communication is the first word in the title of this course. So hopefully by the end of this one and the next one, you'll have a clearer picture. You are always welcome to let me know if something is still not clear, either in a comment here on the lecture or somewhere else. So in this one, we will just be defining culture and communication's relationship to culture. We'll talk about some examples, but they're not all going to be sports examples, just because I want you to think broadly about culture first before we apply that to the world of sports. Before we get started, just some reminders about lecture participation. I forgot to mention this in the first one. So if you didn't do all of these things in the first one, don't worry about it. I'm not really going to penalize you if you missed something. But going forward, to receive full credit on lecture participation, you have to do the following, and this is a minimum, so you can go above and beyond if you want. Answer all the prompts. There's usually between 3 and 5. If I ask a question at some point and I don't have a little pause symbol on the slide, means that's not a required question, but it's one that you are welcome to answer to count as like an extra comment, or if you just want to answer it because you want to. But in terms of what I'm counting for the prompts, it's only the ones where there's a pause symbol on the slide. Use a marker at least once. So I have a slide about this coming up, but the markers are the little buttons that you see. And so you can use one of those at least one time. Students usually use them all throughout. Or if you don't want to use the markers, add an additional comment somewhere. So either answer one of the optional questions or just make a comment. Third, ask a question at some point. And if you don't want to ask a question, respond to a peer's comment. And you just hit a little reply button and you respond to something one of your peers said. So this is how I am looking at your lecture participation. Points wise, it really depends on the week. Like this first week, there are 3 lectures and I have them at 5 points each. So answering all the prompts is 3 points, marker is 1 point, question is 1 point. In other cases, if we only have 2 lectures, it will be more like a 7 and an 8 points per week. Total 15 points is what we're looking at, but the specific breakdown may change. So here are the markers. These are fun. GoReact is just a really fun tool. I've used it in all my classes for lots of different things. It was created as a tool for like public speaking classes, and the markers were like little ways to give feedback. But I figured, since I'm sort of in a public speaking situation, give me feedback. So not just answering the questions that I ask you, but give me feedback like, wow, that's interesting. Or why fascinating, neat example. Already knew this is a way to tell me like you learned about this in another class or you just already knew it. And then I've added, the fun phrases at the end that you may be familiar with in your everyday life. You don't have to use those ones if you feel like it's kind of cheesy or that I'm pandering to you or something like that. You don't have to. I will say, though, that students in my spring semester really enjoyed them. And I personally feel like it improved the engagement because I could see more authentically what the response was. Like, hits different is a much more specific reaction than interesting. Interesting is super vague. So Have fun with the markers. Again, you have a checklist of what you need to do, but interact with this as much as you want, because the more you do, the more you're going to learn from it. All right, let's get into it. So here's our first pause. So that's what I mean by the pause symbol. Our opening discussion. If you ran into another LR grad on the street in a different city, how would you know? Or would you know right away? Say you start chatting with them. What would your topics of conversation be when reflecting on your time at LR? So this is a hypothetical situation. Just how would you know if you had no other information, you never met this person before? What would give you a clue that they are an LR grad? Put it in the chat. All right, I'll use myself as an example just because I didn't graduate from LR, and our culture of where we went to undergrad is very strong, and it's very strong when we relate it to sports specifically. So I did my undergrad at Penn State. If I was in another city or another country, one telltale sign is if someone was wearing a Penn State shirt or had some sort of keychain, some sort of artifact. So we call these artifacts. And in terms of the graphic here on the left-hand side of the screen, artifact is actually a subdivision of language. So it's an object that communicates something. And I mean, it would have the words Penn State on it as well. So in the same vein, some sort of thon or sports memorabilia. So maybe it's, so like we are one team was a phrase one year in athletics that is not necessarily unique to Penn State, but if it was in navy and white, that would clue me in a little bit. So those colors are a part of the language. Thon, dance marathon. Lots of universities have dance marathons now, but like the logo of Thon at Penn State is very particular. So thinking logos, colors, words. And then if we started talking, we would refer to places like the Hub or Cafe 210. And when I'm saying these things to you listening, you don't know what I'm talking about because you didn't go to Penn State. And maybe you know someone who did. Let me know in the chat. Specific people like the Willard Preacher or high profile athletes, coaches, certain names that would come up that none of you know, but if I'm talking to another Penn State grad, we know. We would talk about West House cookies. We would talk about rituals like the Mifflin Streak or 55 Days of Cafe. We would talk about local bands like LoJack. And again, I'm sharing with you this list not because I want you to like memorize the culture of Penn State, but to show you that it's going to be different for different universities that you attend. They all have a specific culture. So thinking about your university as like a microcosm of what culture means. And this is how I was just fleshing out an example from my life to you. Ultimately, culture is about shared meaning. So when I'm talking to that Penn State grad, we have this base of shared meaning, shared experiences that we have, shared language, shared rituals. That's what makes our culture. So culture doesn't have to be nationality. It doesn't have to be the country of origin. As I mentioned in lecture 1, yes, that's where culture takes place. They're rooted somewhere. But in the university example, you all share that space for 4 years and then you leave, but that doesn't mean that culture goes away. You take that with you as part of your identity. So that's how we think about shared meaning without borders, without certain areas, etc. Because there are alumni from Penn State, at least, all over the globe. And I'm sure it's true for LR too. It's a smaller group, but they're all over now. So it's not just being on campus. It's where it starts. So there are lots of definitions of culture worded differently, but saying essentially the same thing. So here's one. Culture is a collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from another. So, collective programming. That sounds kind of like weird or evil. And in some cases, it can be weird and evil if you think about what a cult is and where the word cult comes from. But it's just, it's just our way of experiencing things that create associations, create ideas, beliefs, attitudes. That's what this collective programming means. It doesn't necessarily mean it's evil or propaganda, though, of course, it can mean that. And I don't want to pretend that it doesn't. So we want to be aware of stereotypes and cultural ethnocentrism. So the point I'm making here is that if a culture, if a group has collective programming and some common beliefs and common experiences, that doesn't mean every single person belonging to that culture is the same. And that's where we get stereotypes. So we know some things about a culture, and then we assume that that applies to every single person we meet from that culture. That's a stereotype. And it doesn't mean that what we know isn't true. It just means it cannot be applied in a way that erases individual difference, erases unique identity. And then cultural ethnocentrism is where members of the group, and we would call it the in group, if you're in the group, you think that your culture is better than every other culture. And these are both real dangers when we're thinking about culture and how people are living together. Cultural ethnocentrism, we're seeing that play out every single day in the news, in politics, in international affairs. And it's also relevant to sports on a much less serious level, obviously, less serious. But if we think about rivalries, that's the easiest example there. So stereotypes are the simplistic generalizations based in some truth, but ultimately, again, a distorted version of the truth cannot be universally applied. Ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own culture is superior to that of other cultures. Here's another graphic. It's kind of blurry. Don't worry about it. And it's just different from the other one I've been showing. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. These are just different ways of thinking about it. So if we think about these circles or levels of depth, the deepest part of a culture is its values. So values like honesty, integrity, love, life, those are values can seem very abstract, and they are. So they're big ideas. And then those values are showing up in the practices that are rituals, heroes, and symbols. So values are the deepest part of a culture's shared meaning, and they manifest in the rituals. So if you think about values in a religion, the rituals of worship, whether that's Christian or Jewish, any of the other religions, there are certain rituals that are reflecting the values of that religious culture. The heroes that we have, Jesus as the hero in Christianity, the symbol of the cross. So I didn't intend on making that a fully religious example, but that's how those things are playing out on different levels of depth. And with the depth piece, symbols are the thing that everybody sees outside of that group. They don't always see the values. And that's why, I'll just keep it with the Christian example. Right now in our political climate, there are lots of outward symbols. The cross is one of them. Biblical passages are another. And for people who don't identify as Christian, they see the preaching of a very conservative priest or pastor and think that that's what Christian values are. It's like bigoted or hateful. But those who identify as Christians say, no, that's actually not the Christian value. That's how a certain person or a certain church, a certain group is manifesting and distorting something. So symbols are what everybody else sees, and they're not always seeing the deeper values, because that's deep. Ultimately, though, we can understand meaning through symbols, and a symbol being a thing that represents or stands for something else, especially a material object representing something abstract. Symbols can be conveyed through words, through images, structures, objects, artifacts, etc. So back to my Penn State example, the t-shirt, the Thon logo, those are all symbols that are like a picture, an artifact, an object, a keychain, whatever. A key symbol in US American culture is our flag. And if you think about what a flag is, what it literally is a piece of cloth with colors on it. But people who design their flags like have a certain reason, and we obviously know the stars are the states, and the stripes were the original colonies. So we know what it means, literally, like why it was designed that way, but it also comes to symbolize something so much deeper: freedom, liberty. Like those are values that are super deep that aren't literally written on the flag, but it symbolizes those values. So here's an optional question: what does a bear represent? So if we're thinking about the deeper values, what does a bear symbolize? What does a bear represent? And why is it LR's mascot? So a video that I had assigned for you to watch before getting to the lectures is this short video called Decoding the Olympic Opening Ceremonies. I have a feeling I'm going to run long on this lecture, so I'm not going to show it. Please go back to that first page of the module and watch it, and I want you to reflect on it, because essentially it's just giving you an analysis of how the opening ceremonies for every Olympic Games are communicating the culture of that nation. And that's going to connect us to the second part of the lecture, which is on how communication impacts culture. So here is our break time. Seriously, pause the video, get up and stretch, get some coffee, play with your pet. Welcome back. So in short, culture can be understood this way: everything means something. Everything. So I want you to stay curious this semester, because these ideas that are coming from a humanities perspective are probably very different from what you're used to. And that's one of the reasons you're required to take classes in a core where you're getting exposed to different perspectives. So it seems so weird, and like you might be tempted to say it's not that deep. But my charge to you is to think of it as that deep. And if that's something that is outside of your comfort zone, embrace it. Stay curious. I should have changed this to everything is that deep, because that's a phrase you would probably understand. Communication is culture, and culture is communication. So this is where, this lecture and the next one, I'm going to say these like circular phrases like this that are just, they call that tautological, where the conclusion is just a repetition of the premise. So communication is culture. Culture is communication. Why am I saying that? Well, communication is ultimately shared meaning, and culture is also shared meaning. So if you remember in the first lecture, we talked about the process of communication, and in this idea of culture, how do you think we came up with the symbol of the flag for America? We had to decide that that's what it was going to be. So communication results in culture. And culture is communicated through symbols, through artifacts, through traditions. So another model of communication, thinking about source and receiver, and source and receiver imply that it's one specific person to another, and that is one type of communication. But source in this case is like the broader society, and receiver is us as individuals living in that society and belonging to a culture. We've got the specific messages, which are usually the values and, those things that are core to a culture, and how those values are put into a form through rituals, through behaviors, through attitudes, etc. So again, remember shared meaning. You can also think of these things as expressions of the human condition. And what's an expression but communication? Communication is the means of human interaction through which cultural characteristics, whether customs, roles, rules, rituals, laws, or other patterns, are created and shared. And at this part of the lecture, it might be good for you to pause just for yourself to read through these definitions and think about them, because I am going kind of quickly because I don't want the video to be super long. But if you need to pause and think about it, pause and think about it. It's not so much that individuals set out to create a culture when they interact in relationships, groups, organizations, or societies, but rather that cultures are a natural byproduct of social interaction. In a sense, cultures are the residue of social communication. Without communication and communication media, so things like the news, entertainment, advertising, it would be impossible to preserve and pass along cultural characteristics from one place and time to another. So, communication is how we preserve culture, how we carry it forward to the next generations. Storytelling and oral culture, before modern society, like way before modern society, that's how culture was preserved, as they told stories. The elders told stories to the younger people in the community, and they maintained those rituals. They maintained recipes, for these ancient dishes and food. That's how culture is preserved and kept. It's communicated. So here's a pause. And this is a bit of a hard transition, which I didn't realize it was such a hard transition, but thinking about LR again. So we opened with this. I want to isolate some of these pieces of the graphic. So if we isolate art, drama, and music, in the context of LR, do you know the words to the LR alma mater or any fight songs? Even if you know like just a phrase, put it in the chat. So non-sports examples of art, drama, and music would be LR's playmakers, the ensembles we have on campus. We have a sacred music program that is, communicating the culture of LR as a Christian university. Second, let's think about attitudes. What are LR students' likes and dislikes? And it doesn't have to be about sports. Do LR sports fans have a preference on what sport they like to watch? So is one more popular than another? How do they feel about coaches or specific athletes? Some non-sports examples: LR students and professors like smaller classes. They prefer in person, and not everybody does. They like or don't like the food in the cafeteria, etc. These are attitudes. What are some rituals that are unique to LR? Type those in the chat. So these can be rituals at sporting events or rituals outside of sporting events, something that's a tradition, something that happens on a regular basis. Chapel on Wednesdays is an obvious one. So we are wrapping up, and this is just something I want you to think about because it's going to take you into the activity. Can you think of other examples from LR's culture that fit into one or more of these 9 elements? Can you think of other examples from a specific culture you identify with? So that's just a thinker. And then for the homework after this lecture, you will be doing an activity where you reflect on your culture. So with all of this in mind from this second lecture of week 1, you're going to think about your own culture. And I want you to be specific about connecting to the ideas from that graphic and from this lecture. And that QR code on there, that's the code you can scan if you want to take the survey. And I actually need to change that QR code because I have a different link. So ignore that. If you want to take the survey, I do have a link from the Canvas description of this. I think this one might have been long. I apologize. I'd really just get into it. And I'm sorry. I'll do better next time. See ya.